us. He protected us through our crisis, our organizational crisis. He stood for us. So he has been a long-time friend. He and Sister Jeanette, they have been friends. We were studying at the seminary. Sister Jeanette saw to it that Nikki had work, in the accountancy, so we had more money so we can buy books. So when we came back to the Philippines, all of the books that, all of you have done to our house, the books that you have seen there was simply because of, the extra hours that were given to us so we can buy more books. Because we thought like we would not be returning to the United States because we were just to study in the U.S. and return to the Philippines and apply all that we have learned. So we got as much books as we can. So Dr. Crick, a friend, a special friend, and it's always been a friend that it has stretched like more than 20 or 30 years, this friendship and this partnership. So Dr. Crick.
Thank you. It's a joy to be here. I was under the assumption that the young people would have another session, but I'm glad you're here. We're trying to readjust our remarks so that we include you and involve you and that you will be an active participant. In the some 35 minutes of time, I want to attempt the lecture and then open it up as much as we can for some questions. I'm looking for my words. Well, it's good to be here. This is a very special relationship. God did some magical and mysterious things through Babes and Nikki and the whole crew, Rosemary, and all the ones in the Philippines. When I went there, in the very early beginning, I realized that God was really bringing all the sectors together. It was like a mysterious encounter of, I don't know that I've seen anything quite like it. If you can believe, it ended up in one of the most amazing services I've ever attended in my life. To this day, don't know how we pulled that one off. They brought all the military people in the Manila area together. Every soldier had to be there. Sailor, Air Force, everybody. They brought all the federal workers, the government workers. And they brought all the police department, all the agencies. And we gathered in a stadium that was unbelievable. Almost 10,000 people, I think they imagined there. And we were able, I had the privilege of addressing those 10,000 people in that stadium around the subject of the moral values that God has instilled in humanity at the birth and how messy it becomes when humanity messes up. The president, he made a statement, I will never forget the president of Philippines. He was describing his own experience. He said, we have people here that if they go to the marketplace and it costs just as much to buy it legally as it does on the black market, he said, our system is a crutch. We will end up buying it on the black market. I thought that was a statement that could apply to all governments. And we ought to understand how easy it is for systems to get corrupted. And this was a vast attempt led by these lieutenants like Faith Pilati and all of those with a spark of inspiration that was really, as I said, was really just, it was like a wind. You didn't bring it. All you did is get caught up in it. And you saw the magic and the power when the Holy Spirit is allowed to work uninterrupted by mankind. And I am the recipient of that in so many other wonderful experiences. Wow, it's good to be here. I'm going to set you up. And I did it recently in Romania, and halfway through it, I had a couple of people walk out and say, that's the most arrogant guy I've ever met in my life. I'm going to set you up. What we're doing here is basically looking at life and ministry. The topic is starting well, doing well, finishing well. I think it applies to all of us. I thought that we'd be talking just to the ministers, but I think it applies to the ministry family as well. Ministry's sick in America today. Sick to the core. Some of the greatest abusers and users of pornography is ministers and ministers' families. 50% of everybody that starts the ministry journey falls out. They don't finish. A survey within our own denomination found out that 75% of who finish with bitterness and anger. So that ministry, in a sense, is what I always tell my students at the seminary. They're the problem. Oh, I know. It'd be so wonderful. You know, we ministers are notorious. Boy, if I only had a better church. If I only had... Isn't that a ridiculous statement? That's like saying if I only had a better sinner. Sinners are the given. The more the merrier. The more messy. If you don't have mentally ill people, get them. Amen. If you don't have mixed marriage people, get them. If you don't have gays, get them. That's what ministry is supposed to be. It's supposed to be healthy leaders dealing with the sickness of our society. But how do you do that? Now, let me tell you something even worse than just a sick ministry. It's a sick system. One of the interesting things with our young man, he did a fantastic job this morning, looking at families. One of the things that you'll find out in the family, it's not just individual. We call them, it's episodic. I mean, it's a family system that's gotten so sick that regardless, you may have a healthy child within that family. But they will eventually become sick because the system's sick. So then we've got a dual problem with ministry, and that's why I'm saying starting well, doing well, finishing well. It's because everything's at stake. I don't care how you cut it, you are the problem, not your church. There's no such thing as a so-called better church. Every one of them's got the same old crowd, and we kind of shift around, you know, like we're going to move from Oregon over to Mississippi. It's nice, wonderful, kind of calm, more traditional, and you find out the same sickness there is everywhere. So we've got to quit messing around trying to avoid some realities that I'm going to very straightforwardly deal with this morning, just out of love, of course. We're going to kill you and love you. I'm an old Army airborne trooper. Let me set you up. I'm a hero. I'm the best you could have gotten. Let me just tell you how wonderful you should feel about the guy that is here today. 83 years old. Been married to the same gal. I didn't bring enough at induction ceremony, but you kind of pass around that folder around and take a look at my bride. You can see her on the front when she was really healthy and vibrant and the like. And on the back page, you'll see there me ministering her. She's a long-term Alzheimer's patient. She's like a 2-year-old. And let me tell you something about you. This woman that has lost all of her memory. She can't remember a thing. In fact, sometimes I said, you know, we're sitting at the table the other day, I said, aren't you so fortunate that you have a guy as good looking as I am, and as talented as I am, and as sharp as I am. And I said, would you ever consider marrying somebody like me? And she smiled and patted me on the shoulder, and she said, if I married somebody like you, my dad would kill me. But let me tell you about me. I'm going to set you up. I'm a hot shot, done it all. 57 years of ministry. I was one of the first Pentecostals to go into the military representing our church. A hero, Vietnam twice. Bronze Star for Valor twice in combat. Jumped out of airplanes. I did it all. I served with the Special Forces, Special Ops. I had 300 jumps. I learned to skydive. My last jump brought the Bible in Cleveland, Tennessee with a skydiving unit to dedicate a parkway there, the Paul Huff Parkway. I've done it all. I am really something super, super special. Prestigious schools. Two best schools in the South, Emory University and Vanderbilt. I'm a graduate of both of those. Wow. Aren't you impressed? I set up I was the first Pentecostal ever to be certified by the Association of Clinical Pastoral Educators. They shut out Pentecostals for years because they thought we were crazy. We had no clinical background. I wrote a definitive dissertation at Emory University proving that there was such a thing as Pentecostal model supervision, that we model more out of our story, our life, our person, our experiences, and that's a good thing if it's managed properly. Left the military, came back and helped set up our MIP program. Brother McGuire knows all. I'm not sure he's getting really impressed with my quick bio here. Set up the MIP program, instituted the first formation classes. My training is basically around 3 areas of development: information, formation, and transformation. And we'll say a word about that in just a minute. But I set up those models that people experienced at their seminary. They had none of that. It was all in the head, nothing in the heart. Pentecostal start with the heart and move to the head. You know that. Educationally, that's the way we act. We do it and then we try to figure out if it's legal or if it's scriptural. That's just our nature. But that's a particular model. If focused on historically, that was the biblical model. That's the way the New Testament practiced. That's how they developed. They just started experiencing things and then they'd come together and say, is this right? You know. And I set that up and had the privilege of teaching at the seminary. Still am a full professor. Have taught consecutively for 26 years the same class. Formation for Life in Ministry. Oh, you're getting really impressed. Done all those things. Let me tell you what my full-time job is today. And let me tell you why she's plugged in with you today. We were sitting the other night. Honestly, her ability to do anything comes inspirationally with the Holy Spirit. She cannot talk logically. She walks around the house talking to the thermostat or talking to the coffee pot. Carries on some wonderful conversations with the coffee pot. Now you better watch it. I've been watching you. That old authority that we talked about as the parent comes out. But the other day we were laying in the bed. This is the honest God's truth. I'm telling you, you're connected. That's why these young people need to hear this. How God works in every single phase of our journey. And why it's so important for you to understand that you're in a particular journey that God has designed, and man is working like a dog to mess it up. Let me tell you why that's important. we're laying there watching this recent floods in the Philippines on TV. I had no idea. In fact, I thought she was asleep. We'd already read the scriptures and had our prayers and gone through the ritual that we go on all night. And I'm watching this terrible flood that ravages the Philippines. Hundreds and thousands. I don't know how many died in that recent flood. But anyway, out of the clear blue, she starts praying. And let me tell you how she prays. She said, now God, you know these people need some help. You got to help them. She said, help those little kids. They've lost their mamas and daddies. They can't find them. And then she prayed a very interesting thing. I said, my Lord, this has to be. I grabbed my tape recorder. I wanted to tape this. She said, help those donors. See, she ran the finance office of seminary. She always thinking about money. Help those donors. And make sure they don't write small checks. That they write the big, big checks. And I'm sitting there just weeping to the core of my soul. Now here's what I'm saying to you. Look at my journey. That impressive journey. And how God takes me full cycle through every one of these. Starting well, doing well, finishing well. I was selected twice above the zone for promotion in the military. All those sections, it's exceedingly, if you read it like a PR, our trouble with pastors and ministers, we believe our own PRs. We wrote it. You remember that? Rosemary, you used to do those PRs. We had to really make it sound good, didn't we? But the truth of the matter is, I'm judged now. Let me illustrate it kind of like a farm. God allowed me to farm 100,000 acres. I had managers and all these subsystems of my farm. I was the manager. What would happen to you if, and are you prepared for this? And has your journey so prepared you for this, that suddenly you go from farming 100,000 acres to 1 acre. Caring for Jeanette, let me give you a typical day. This guy that I just described with all these exploits and all these ribbons and all these accomplishments. I change her diaper about 5 times a day. I gave a lecture the other day at the Alzheimer's Association and described the sacredness of that task that God has given me, similar to the task He gave to the women whose job it was to go and prepare the battered and beaten and crucified body of our Lord. How sacred that must have been. And they could take that beaten body, wipe all that blood and crud off, and to clean that body and wrap it in fine linens with the best perfumes that they could find, and lay it in a tomb. And that's my experience. Now, I didn't come easy with this. I am a workaholic, hard one. When Jeanette was first diagnosed with Alzheimer's, I have some clinical background, a lot of clinical background. So I immediately became an expert in all the medications, all the functionalities of treating people. Let me tell you about Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's affects 47 different major cell groups. We know that. You can't properly diagnose whether somebody died of Alzheimer's until they die. It has to be done with an autopsy because it's a very technical disease. Everybody that has dementia doesn't necessarily have Alzheimer's. Because Alzheimer's disease takes you gradually. Unlike some other forms of dementia, it takes you gradually, it chips away. And for me, it was like a 6-year, 7-year journey. We began to notice that Jeanette was not able to respond as she did, and she was losing the cutting edge and would forget where her keys was and things like that. But anyway, make a long story short, I went back into my mode. Mr. Perfect jumps out of airplanes, goes to the best university is, does all those things. I went back. I was going to become an expert. I was going to direct this, and it was going to turn out to be just as successful as every other accomplishment that I've ever taken on. So I worked like a dog. And finally one day, the Lord said to me very clearly in prayer, this one you don't fix. You have to accept this with the same reverence and the same dignity as you've accepted every other task I've ever given you. So now I go from farming 100,000 acres down to 1 acre. And I can tell you this, I know you won't believe it because you're part of this whole mad system of success. You won't believe it. But this is the best job I've ever had that God gave me. The best, the most satisfying. I'm a happy camper. I wasn't for 4 years because I was going to fix it. I took her to the best experts. I did my clinical training and my residency at a renowned memory clinical unit at Emory University Hospital, and I went there and I found out that her doctors didn't know beans about this disease. They're pill pushers. The best people that's taught me this, how to treat and how to respond to this, have been people who have had mothers and uncles, or aunts and uncles and others that had this disease, and they have taught me plenty. But it's the best job I've ever had. Starting well, doing well, finishing well. That kind of gives you the intro. Now, what am I talking about? Let me tell you that you have the little handout I prepared. The first statement is a very important statement. Starting well, doing well, finishing well. It says the introduction. Who am I? And what's my main focus? I've already told you who I am. Here is the proposition. If you can absorb this, you can plug into it, and I will try to make it as personal as I can. This thing, what we call the movements in ministry. I gave you one set of those movements. Starting, doing, finishing. If you want to think of that, that's phases in ministry. Let me parenthetically kind of get off that and tell you the problem is we don't respect God's order and plan. We want to create our own. And there's another problem. People get stuck in these movements and they don't have the resources to identify when God's moving you from 100,000 acre to 1 acre. Or on the other hand, from 1 acre to 100,000 acre. There are optimal moments, critical events that I'm going to be addressing briefly, that happens in the life of the minister and the minister's family that tells us when to move and when not to move. And we simply have never trained our clergy to identify those optimal moments. And so consequently, God has a plan for your life. It was designed at your birth. He has a place for you to finish, but you've never acquired, or you have even rejected, the insight that must be necessary to be able to move from one area of that movement to the next area, to the next area, and finally to the finish line. Is everybody plugged in? Am I still communicating? Okay. Yeah. Do our young people understand what we're saying here? That ministry is so important. Number one, your mom and dad your family was handpicked for an enormous task. Being moral, being mature, being insightful, being leaders in a society that's missing all of that. Many ministers, unfortunately, have simply joined the crowd. They don't stand out. Where's our leaders today? Even in America, I keep saying, who is speaking for the Christian church today? Nobody at that top level. Nobody. Homosexuality. Believe you me, the Supreme Court within weeks, undoubtedly within the next year, will authorize homosexual marriages as the law of the land. You can count on it. Who's speaking? I don't hear any voices. Where's our leaders? And my theory is that simply because we have failed to recognize the basic principles that I want to kind of lay out very quickly. Principle number one is there is a particular movement. It's very biblical. God never intended any of us to get stuck at one particular area. I was a combat chaplain. I loved it. I loved to jump out of airplanes. My goodness. I love that. I was fascinated. I made 17 jumps in one day just to break a record. Being a crazy old colonel. Probably cost the Army $200,000 to use those helicopters. Up and down, one day. Nutty. I loved it. But an old sergeant major once saw this young guy that was so hell-bent on getting ribbons and getting awards and getting accolades and doing all the things that your name would appear in the paper. He called me aside and he said, Bob, he said, minister at this low level. The low level is called the battalion. That's where they have a chaplain with about 1,000 troops. Oh, it's wonderful. You're among the, for me with the airborne, the elite. I mean, guys, I'd go out on these patrols. It was wonderful. And get to shoot them up, and nearly get killed, and all that kind of stuff. You know, it was embedded in my soul. I was so ego hungry coming from a sharecropper's farm. And now I'm a lieutenant, I'm a captain, I'm a major, I'm a colonel. I'm eating this stuff up. But he called me aside and he said, I need to give you a clue. At the very basic level, he said, work like a dog in the trenches. At this basic, common level, but always be thinking about the next move. When you're not the battalion chaplain, you're the brigade chaplain. The brigade chaplain gets to supervise 10 other chaplains. Wow. Or he said, think about while you're at the brigade level, be thinking of the division level. You get to supervise about 40 chaplains. Or think about, at that level, what would happen if you got to the chief of chaplain's office and you became the chief. You get to supervise 1,500 chaplains. But here's another clue he said to me. He said, you got to realize that in the Army, to make it, you have to move from player to coach to super coach. That is a particular movement that we're not training our people to do. I've seen these people. I get so disgusted with our seminarians. They come, they have such low sense of their own worth and value, and oftentimes I get disgusted and say, why is it that I think you will go much further and higher than you can even think? I'm having to think that way. So basically, my point is that ministry is a movement. The Bible's clear. You can't remain forever stuck in the bottle. You can't be babes. Eventually, you have to become mature, self-sustaining, good leaders. You have to be able to critically analyze the situation, look at it, evaluate it, and eventually you have to give up being the quarterback. There's nothing more unbecoming to me than someone my age still trying to throw a football as a quarterback. Can you imagine that? Well, I'm in charge. This is my football team. I know I've got a good quarterback. My Lord. He was All-American at UCLA. But buddy boy, you're going to sit on the bench today because I'm going to quarterback. God doesn't need more quarterbacks. He's got a whole lot of them. We saw one give us the devotion this morning. Terrific young people waiting in the wings, ready to do. What is hurting our churches today is that we've not appreciated God's movement from player to coach and eventually super coach. There's another way of thinking about that. You move from, I don't have anything here. I'm just running by the seat of my britches here. You move, it's like a diamond shape. Can you all see that? You can kind of imagine it. You get the call to ministry. Now, this is the interesting thing. That was a specialized call. All we wanted to do was just get people saved. We didn't know that other things existed. We didn't know anything about the politics of the church or the little old ladies that will run you ragged with griping about the color of the carpet or the chandelier that somebody gave that isn't worth 2 hoots a handy, and we got to keep it hanging there because somebody's little plaques on it, and that kind of stuff. That's the call to the ministry. We just simply enter the ministry because, wow, we want to save souls. We just want to get out there and preach and do our thing. But guess what? God bursts your bubbles pretty quick. You get your first church. Ha 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 ha. Now you're everything. You're not an evangelist. You're a bus driver. You go and pick up those kids. If everybody takes off after this meeting today, you're the only guy there. You're going to clean up this room. Stack those chairs. So here's why that's important. God's not going to, down here, that last phase of ministry where we become the coach, the super coach, the specialist. God's not going to let you do that until you have fulfilled well every one of these experiences of ministry. You can't get by any longer and say, well, I'm just a preacher, No, you got to be a good counselor. Come on now. If you don't understand child abuse, it makes me sick that people say, well, that's just not my calling. It is absolutely your responsibility. Every person in that church represents a particular care and spiritual need that minimally you have to be trained enough to fulfill that need while you're a pastor in that church. Have you ever heard about referring people? You say, well, I've got this schizophrenic. I'm not trained in clinical. Well, you got people, all you got to do is learn how to pick up the phone and refer to a clinic. So that my point is that this movement of ministry, we start out as a specialist, and then, bless what? You could almost think this in terms of years, 1 to 5 years in the ministry. If you're following God's plan, it may be 5, 15 to 20. That. And then, if you have been faithful and follows the few recommendations that I've got time for this morning to talk about things you must do, then God, honoring His movement, His own pattern, His own passion for building the kingdom, He finally allows you to move into the area of specialization. So, call to ministry, experiencing of ministry and specialization in the deepest areas of ministry. Wouldn't this be a shame that you would spend 30, 40 years pastoring a wonderful U.S. Filipino church and you're still known as a pastor / evangelist, nothing else? Wouldn't that be something? You've seen all these people, you've done all these things, and yet you've not, something happened along your ministry journey. That you're getting ready, you're 83 years old like me, and you're retiring as a generalist. Oh, he was good. Kind of did everything kind of halfway. And let me tell you, the kind of world that we're living in today with the complexities of ministry, you better stop thinking being a generalist. You'll be eating for breakfast. How would you handle a situation where a woman comes in and she says, Pastor, I'm really in love with you? I can tell you how most of you would handle it because I have counseling students. They say, well, that's good. What I would do is I would get my secretary to sit outside my door. Anytime she comes in, I have a big glass there so I can be protected just in case something happens here that's going to bring about discretion. Or even better yet, just say, now, sister, that's not appropriate. My Lord, heaven, that's violation of Scripture. That's not appropriate at all. Shame on you saying that to your pastor. I'm a holy man. Let me tell you what the professional answer is, and I teach counseling. The professional answer to that little story would be this. Let me give you a way. And you have to receive this level of training because of the complexities into which God is saying to you. Number one, you have to think to yourself, now why is she saying that? And so your mind begins to look at the scene. She lives with a drunken husband that beats the daylights out of her every single day. Her sexual relationship with that husband is experienced every time as rape, not love. She's already so browbeaten down, but she comes to church, she gets saved, and the most gentle, loving person she's ever met in her life is a pastor from that pulpit. Jesus experienced this numerous times. People fell in love with him physically. Here's the textbook answer, and it takes training. That's why you've got to move from just this experiences of ministry to specialists in ministry. The textbook answer would be something similar to this. Sister Jones, you paid me such a great compliment. I accept your love. I accept your love. But I will assure you that it won't ever be violated. And eventually, we will move from me being a person that you love physically, emotionally, that you will find others that you can freely love without. The point is, and this is the counseling technique, you have to be clean enough conduit, like Jesus was, that people can pass their issues through your conduit without your unresolved stuff in ministry getting entangled with their need to find a solution to their deep problems. Now, you're probably thinking, this comes through training with the kind of people that we are experiencing today. So, my point is that we have to move from the call to the experience of, and finally, this is what's so missing in our churches today. Specialization. Specialization and all of these movements happen in what we call a move from information, right here, information, to formation. You're being formed, to transformation. Player, coach, super coach. Or there's other words for that, consultant. Let's stop that. You understand what I'm talking about movements? Do you understand why it's important that we focus on that and begin to hold our ministers responsible? To begin to take seriously that God has a plan? We're going to be talking about my book. You're the guys right here that ought to be thinking already about what books you're going to provide for the ministry. What kind of training programs are you going to do? What kind of... stop thinking at the battalion level. It's a wonderful place to be. But thinking about the fact that as you move into your upper years, and God has some special kinds of tasks. God's looking for these specialists who don't have to hit the home run. They can rejoice over what happens to their players. I watched last night, my team, Vanderbilt, won the National Baseball College Championship. They beat Virginia. And the coach was there. It was unbelievable, just exactly what I'm saying. The coach was there. They had a press conference. And the coach, every time they kind of move in, now coach, that ingenious, when you pull that picture out and put in another one that kind of worked, and he would come back and say, oh, come on now, folks. It's about the players. It's my players. With tears in his eyes, he said, these are the guys. They won the championship. Ask them the questions. Stay away from me. I'm a coach. Do you get the gist that finally the thing that deeply satisfies you at the end when you come to the closure of your ministry? For me, it's the Babes Pilati that I had the privilege of teaching and being with. It's the hundreds of chaplains, literally thousands of chaplains. I didn't do any of that. It was the players. The coach's job is to be able, with intelligence and with training, with insight, to be able to release the gifts that exist in every congregation to the point that the entire church becomes an instrument of power and of grace and goodness. Do you get the message? I'm going to shift now. Ha ha. This is what I love. And that's in your second handout, if you want to go there. It's the reality of what hinders this movement. It's because many of us entered the ministry without realizing that it was relational from the beginning. It's relational at its midpoint, and it's relational at the end. Jeanette loves this caregiver. She doesn't know I'm her husband. She has no idea. But she loves the care that I give her. And she will so oftentimes, right in the middle of cleaning up, giving her a bath, or doing something like that, she will pat me on the cheek and say, thank you. Thank you for helping me. Ministry is very relational. It's also professional. Stop thinking of yourself as a jackleg, jack of all trades, part-time. No, when God called you, He called you professional. High-level ministry, not cheap. I don't care what kind of church you're running or where the people are from, they deserve the very best, Brother Paul. They deserve the best. And if you don't have it, you have to be able to get it. It comes simply down to that. This morning's USA Today had a whole big feature, something I'm very interested in and worked in, talking about mental health in America today. Mental health in America today. How deplorable and disgusting is the fact that we're not treating people even minimally. Even it said that countries like Jamaica has better mental health programs than the U.S. So that while we need a professionalism there, we need it in the ministry. So relationships is everything. Let me talk a little bit about what happens in relationships. Why are our relationships important? Well, number one, it's from the Word of God from the very beginning. It was relationships. It wasn't about what you did. How many of you have really developed, I know we talk about it, but how many of you have really developed a total unconditional model of care for your ministry? Totally unconditional. That means that, and this is kind of, I learned this kind of out of my military year. If a soldier comes in to see you, your temptation, of course, you know he's a sinner, your temptation is to begin to think about him as a candidate for salvation. You know that's unscriptural. Now let's let that sink in just a minute. I know, I'm controversial. That's unscriptural. Because if you start thinking that I want him to do something, even an altar experience, in order to receive my relationship with him, you've already violated Scripture. Unconditional love means that there's no conditions. That I will receive him at whatever level, whatever depth, whatever is his problem, I will receive him unconditionally. We start with a mere fact that he's part of God's creation. We'll be talking a little bit about that, about my book, how that God is a global God, an inclusive God, and that every person, that's why the secular is just as religious as is the religious, and the religious is just as secular as is the secular. The temple and the marketplace, and God's endeavor, all these are his children. So unconditional relationships means just that. I will receive them unconditionally. I'm not going to start thinking about how much time he will pay or she will pay. I'm not going to think about the fact that they make a nice Sunday school teacher. We can get them saved and get them into our church and not. No, you receive them just like they are. So that ministry is relational in everything that we do. There's no aspect of ministry that is not relational. It includes not only your one-on-one, it includes also your committee meetings with those hard-headed elders. What time do we end here? How much time do we have left? I want to pace myself. 12 o'clock. What time is it now? So we got another what? 20 minutes? 30 minutes? We got another hour. We're going to leave a lot of time for questions because I'm going to make you even more aggravated before this session goes. Now, because it is basically bar none relational, then you have to start thinking of yourself as a person that can enter, because of your maturity, can enter into all levels of relationship as a minister of the gospel. So that's your goal. That's where your information, you're getting that today, your formation One of the interesting things we do at the seminary, when we're dealing with the formation and look at the psychological tests and all the other inventories, there are times we say to them, you gotta quit being a student. We're going to make you a client. You don't need education. You need therapy. You need counseling. And our church, unfortunately, does that as poorly as any denomination that I know. Even the Episcopalians, with all their faults and everything, they do an extensive interview of all their candidates for ministry with a psychiatrist. Now, remember I said that the secular belongs to God too. We'll get to that in the chaplaincy part, the second lecture. But the truth of the matter is, so if it's relational, then it's driven by, if you see on your little chart, the basic human needs to relate properly. And it lists two things very interesting. It lists the drives that we have that we bring into ministry. Our needs that are listed as the need for order and authority. If I had time, I could really go into each one of these. One of the biggest problems we have with ministers is the reason they receive the call of the ministry, they don't want to be a layman. They want a boss from the pulpit. And most ministers, in surveys that we've taken, do not know how to worship unless they are preaching. They don't raise their hands. They don't enter worship. I was glad to see Brother and Sister McGuire. They were into the worship. That's wonderful. By the way, it's a joy to be with them and teaming up with them. But basically, order and authority. There's a need for a sense of belonging. These are basic human needs, if unfulfilled, in the life of the ministry, will come out negatively in your relationships. So the need to belong, the capacity for affirmation of achievements, acceptance, understanding, and a sense of shared purpose. Turn your page. Let me list up very briefly the things that ministers historically, that has been evaluated, that bring into the ministry, that entrap them from feeling and fulfilling those basic needs within themselves as well as those basic needs in others. Let me just list them very quick. I don't have a whole lot of time. I want to leave a lot of time for your discussion. First of all, you come into the ministry with hidden agendas. It's not pure. You couldn't get a job. We have many people just show up to seminaries and get a job. They've been unemployed for 2 years. They can get government loans. Hidden agendas. Maybe you're running from something. You may have struggles with your sexuality. You want to come to a seminary or come to a religious institution that you can hopefully control those passions that's inside you. So they're hidden agendas. Secondly, anger. Unresolved emotions of anger. Goodness, have you ever sat in a guy preaching and he's just laying everybody low and you say, wow, what did I do to deserve all this anger from this guy? A lot of prophetic preachers are simply people that have got a lot of unresolved anger and they love to take it out on us. Unsuspecting people coming to a service and they just lay us in the shade. Or what about grief? The Catholic Church did the best job. They said in one study they did, they found out that a high percentage of their priests finally went into the priesthood after experiencing a very significant loss in their life. Pay attention to grief. Grief will linger. Grief can be taken care of. It's one of those things that you can really get cured from. But if you have a loss of a church, loss of a position, loss of anything, that lingers until finally you go through some counseling and begin to say that this grief has got to be dealt with. I've had high-level officials, one in particular that lost his wife to cancer. And he would go over to her grave and would lay on the grave and grieve. And I'd go and just sit there with him and let him grieve. Because that has to be eventually. If it gets in any of these things, if they get internalized, you can now see the movement. Let's say up here you get identified. This is the time information. Somebody says, you come to Bible college and they say, you got a chip on your shoulder. You better deal with that. Well, guess what? They come down to the formation level when they're dealing with all these complexities of ministry. And they've still got those unresolved tensions, grief, anger, lack of intimacy. That's one of the unresolved losses. Sexual struggles, dysfunctionalities. I got in trouble when I first came to Cleveland. In 1978, out of the military, I came with all this political training. I thought everybody was ready to receive Bob Crick with his direct talk. And I had this general official. He's on the executive committee. He was angry. And later on, he found out he had all sorts of sexual dysfunctionalities and wheeling and dealing and everything. And I called him in the hallway one day, and I made the mistake of saying, "Sir, you're very angry. Would you like for me to help you get a counselor so you can deal with that?" Lord, behold, you think I'd committed the unpardonable sin. I received a letter saying, don't bring that psychology stuff into here. Another thing I experienced in our headquarters, it was very sanctimonious, sinless place to come from. I came out of dirty old army, come into this headquarters, and they had a big sign in the front door as you would go into the headquarters. You can't come in here with slacks or shorts on. Boy, all of you violated that. I saw some people who were shopping around here with slacks on. Shame on you. But anyway, I was so stupid enough, I had run clinics in the military that these people began to come to me. Wanted counseling. They come up on the 3rd floor where I was working with the general education department, and they would come for counseling. Most of them were officials' daughters or sons, or somebody with some real struggles. So I get this letter. I still have it. I framed it. It's in my office at my home. From a general official says, "You can't do counseling in this building." You thought you had it hard? You should have been back there with me. You can't do counseling in this building. This is an administrative building. So I had a lot of fun there because if I can't do counseling out of that building, it only lasted 2 years. That's when I moved to the seminary. Got the heck out of Dodge before they crucified me. You can't do counseling in this building. Shame on any of us that we set up our conclaves of sacredness. Young people with struggles can't come, and divorcees that's trying to take care of 2 kids. They find somebody that they're living with in order that they can pay the bills. Or we have someone who has a long history of this, that, and the other, and they can't come because we've set this up as a sacred place. Let me tell you this, lest I forget it. One of the most profound scriptures you'll find about Jesus and his crucifixion is in the 13th chapter of Hebrews. When I discovered this, I thought I knew all there was to know about his death and resurrection and life. But the 13th chapter of Hebrews describes him as having been crucified and killed. And they identify him with the dead carcasses, the remains of those that they took, the animals that they took into the temple, and they offered as a sacrifice, and whatever was left after the sacrificial offering would do, because the temple was safe, they would take those remains, the blood and guts and the messy part of that animal, and they would take it outside Jerusalem because Jerusalem was holy. And they would put those carcasses and bury them in this land that was already stained because it was outside the temple, and so they would bury it. And the 13th chapter of Hebrews in the Greek identifies that that's what it meant when it said that Jesus was taken outside the gates. That's the name of my book, is Outside the Gates. And that's where they identified him with the dead, unwanted, finished remains of the most despicable, unimaginable flesh and bones that you could conceive. And then we say, you can't come into this place? Guess who gets left out when we say that? I don't have to identify that. Okay, let's talk about this a little bit more. These hidden agendas, this anger, these dysfunctionalities, on your journey of ministry, I'm not going to say too much, I'm just going to leave it. On your journey of ministry, getting from player, coach, super coach, specialist, whatever God has planned for you. I can prove it. I do a lot of analysis, clinical analysis. If I could spend time right now with any young person here, I'd love to. I've done it publicly in meetings. Give me 15 to 20 minutes and I could get to something in your system very deeply that would surprise you down here. God's already planted in the mind and heart of every single one of us that we're going to be something super special someday. You're going to write the books. You're going to conduct the music. You're going to develop the program. It's there. It's laid. Just waiting for us to take seriously that God has all of us on this fabulous journey. My daughter, eight-year-old granddaughter, Rachel, she's singing this next week before 1,000 people. She's 8 years old. She has a voice second to none, as far as I'm concerned. But she has insensitivity for her granddad. She came in when she was about 4 years old. She said, "Oh, boy, you're going to go to hell." I said, "Why am I going to go to hell, Rachel?" She said, "Because you spoiled me rotten." I said, "Well, you want me to quit spoiling you rotten? I can do that." "Oh, let's wait a while." And I was telling them today, we went in Staples, she introduced me as that, she said, finally got to me, she's introduced, she's about 5 or 6 years old. She said, "This is my opa," and she told the clerk, "This is what you look like when you get real old." She takes no prisoners. But I look at that 8-year-old and I realize, where'd that come from? I can't sing a lick. She's going to be singing before 1,000 people with a very complex song. It's a secular song. It's her coach and model is our pastor's wife. She's just a fantastic singer. But it's very complex. It's about somebody that falls in love with some guy at Starbucks. And he goes through all these phases of life. And I'm sitting there listening and watching the expressions on her face and saying, wow, that has to be something more profound than just something. I know, because I know her parents. I know me. The issue is that if God has put that in us, these things that I've mentioned that do not ever get attended to, your unresolved anger, your struggle with authority, your unresolved passions and intimacy, sexuality, and all those struggles, for God's sake, let me encourage you, both at the bishop's level and all your programs, provide counseling for people that come to these conferences, and provide resources, and provide those things that can cause us to reflect and to begin to cleanse that vessel So that when the woman at the well experience happens and finds Jesus there and his disciples are already gone to buy food in town, he's alone with this woman who's probably a known prostitute of the city and has lived with numerous persons. And that famous story about, would you give me drink? And she begins to experience a man differently than any man she'd ever experienced. And her explanation was a proclamation that should come from every person that we encounter. If we've got our own act together, was words like that, like this. I met a man. I met a man that heard me. I met a man that was compassionate. I met a man that did not abuse me. I met a man that did not take advantage of me. I met a man. Or I met a woman. So it comes with that cleansing that can only take place through good training, paying attention to those optimal moments when God is opening doors for you to move to another level and to take advantage of moving from coach to specialist. I always do this because people generally have not been exposed to this theory.